and welcome to the first lecture for Introduction to the Philosophy of the Social Sciences. I am Canoa Meriwether, and let's get started. Your reading for this lecture is Alexander Rosenberg's article, What is the Philosophy of Social Science? And you also want to scan the David Hume page in Philip Stokes' 100 Essential Thinkers. There's a little mention of him near the end here. But most of what I'm going to be talking about is Alexander Rosenberg. And yes, this is this is probably the most difficult article that you're going to have to read. Again, that's because he's a philosopher and he assumes that folks have a basic grounding in philosophy that not most people have. So I'll do my best to try and explain what he's talking about there. And feel free to give me a call or email me with any questions. So why philosophy? Well, philosophy is a discipline for attaining knowledge via critical, rational thought, as we saw with that, sort of looking at the distinction between, myth and science, and, looking at Thales, the first philosopher and the first scientist, right? So philosophy, though, is a meta-discipline. Philosophy is a discipline that overarches all other disciplines, yeah? It's a form of knowledge generation that applies to every single human endeavor that exists. So philosophy explores the why questions, yeah? Whereas science typically, most of our endeavors, explores the how questions or the what questions. Philosophy asks why, and it also asks us how we know what we say we know. Yeah, how do you know that the sky is blue? You say that you know what color the sky is. Well, how do you know that to be true? So some other philosophical questions that Rosenberg introduces here are things like, what is knowledge? What really is the shape of the information that we have in our head? And that's one of the things that cognitive psychology is grappling with right now. And they've got several different theories about what form does knowledge take, especially in our head. We have some sort of semantic web in our mind that links categories and explanations and properties of objects with others. Yeah, that's the basic theory in cognitive psychology about what form knowledge takes in the brain. But the philosophical question is, what exactly does that mean? What is knowledge? Let's say of a minor bird. What exactly is that? Yeah, and what do we say? What can we justify and say is truth and knowledge about this minor bird? Another question, a philosophical question, is whether or not any objective reality really exists. Yeah, is there such a thing as objective justice, where everyone gets the same thing, the fair shake? Is there such a thing as truth? Does objective truth really exist, or is everything subjective? Is it all dependent upon the context of the observer and the actors in the event? Another question is whether or not we can even comprehend objective reality if it's there for us to comprehend. Yeah, and this goes all the way back to the Greeks again. Back to the notion of Plato and his notion of forms and things, and his allegory of the cave that you'll be reading about when we do the political science. But so we're not even sure if we can comprehend objective reality. Another philosophical question is whether or not, how do we know that a fact is real or a fact is true? For example, again, we say by observation, the earth is round, the earth is a sphere, yeah, it is a globe. Well, how do we know, for real, for sure that is true? Me personally, I haven't really done many experiments. I'm relying on what other people have told me. And I'm basically saying, well, I get in an airplane and it flies me from one place to another, and they tell me that that's because the earth is round and it takes this long to get from here to there. But do I really know that to be absolutely true? I can't really justify it. I just believe it to be true based on what other people tell me. Another aspect of philosophy is the sort of normative question, which is basically not just how are things in the real world, but how should things be? So, for example, how should human beings live? What is the good life for human beings? What is the best life? And how can we structure our society to allow every single human being to live the best possible life that they can? Yeah. So Rosenberg talks about the questions that link philosophy to science, and he divides them into two different sets. The first set looks at the notion of what exactly can science explain, and what are the limits for science. Yeah, how can what are the areas where scientific explanation falls apart? Yeah, so uh, when looking at what science can explain, there's some things we can explain and some things we can't. And we've seen from our past history that we've had questions in the past that we could not answer that we can now. So, for example, we could not answer what makes people sick in the past. Now we have improved technology and understanding of germs and microbes and bacteria and viruses. Now we're able to answer these are the things that cause many forms of illness. Again, questions about what makes our eyes blue or our eyes brown, or what makes our hair straight or makes it curly. Well, now we have improved technology, better questions. We're able to identify things such as genes and DNA that give us an answer. So we've got this improved technology. Science seems really strong and capable of explaining some extremely complex things, but there are still many limits for science, many areas where science falls apart. For example, we want to ask, what is the nature of time? Yeah, science cannot tell us why we have this sort of linear progression, and things can't go backwards, they can only go forwards. Yeah, or at least we think that they only go forwards, we believe they only go forwards. um, but we're really having a difficult time grasping the nature of time. Another question that science can't answer is whether or not there is a supreme omnipotent being. Yeah, does God exist? Is it male, female, non-gender? What is it out there? Yeah, and science is not set up to answer that question. Another aspect where science falls apart is the question regarding the origin of the universe. Where does all matter come from? Has it always been this way? If not, what was it? Yeah, um, the greatest scientific minds have grappled with this question, and we've got the best answer that we have is singularity. Yeah, when you read a physics textbook, it tells you that our universe exists because of what was known as the Big Bang. And before the Big Bang, all matter, the entire universe, was comprised of a singular entity that was, I believe, smaller than the head of a pin. Yeah. So that doesn't make a lot of sense to most folks. It makes sense to physicists, but it doesn't still explain what was the singularity, and what happened before the singularity, and what caused the singularity. It doesn't explain that. And then finally, of course, those existential questions about what happens when we die, and is there anything afterlife and that sort of thing. Science cannot tell us. Yeah, it can help us to quantify when death occurs, but even there's a continuum of loss of function and that sort of thing. And that's another really interesting question. And medical ethics is, when do we say that someone is truly completely dead? Yeah. So we've also got the evaluative and normative questions that link philosophy to science. And some of those questions are things like, what is normal? What is normal behavior? Yeah. Is it normal to get a tattoo? Is it normal to be a student? Is it normal to have a child? All those things. Yeah. What is normal? Uh, what is right? What is good? What is the good life? What is the right thing to do? Yeah. Should we always follow laws? Should we always be fair? Are there times when it would be counter to our best interest to follow the law, to follow what we think is right or good? And of course, how should people be governed is one of those normative questions. How should we organize ourselves? Yeah, to do we want to permit the greatest freedom and lifestyle for all, or do we want to support certain members at the expense of others? You know, social sciences often includes implied values when we're looking at evaluative questions, right? Um, you know, when you're looking at the natural sciences, things like medicine, pharmacology, they can produce a new drug, right? They can produce a tuberculosis drug or an AIDS drug, but pharmacology and medicine can't tell us how we should distribute this. Yeah, should we, because basically, you know, it can produce a new chemical, but it doesn't then tell us who should get it first. Should the rich get it first? Should the people suffering the most get it first? Yeah. And another natural science, physics. We use physics to create rockets and bombs, but physics doesn't tell us about how we should use those bombs or whether or not we should use them. Yeah. The second set of questions that link philosophy to science are those questions about the limits of science and why does science have limits? Why can we not answer every single question that we have? What is the flaw that keeps science from being the final, answer? The second question is, what method would then answer those if not science? How would we answer those questions? What happens after death, and what's the origin of the universe? Is religious revelation the proper method? Would authority of the wise or rationalism be the proper method of answering these questions if not science? Is political or popular consensus an appropriate method if we choose to abandon science? And then if we look and if we argue the opposite and we say science has no limits, yeah, then if it has no limits, then why are all these questions still here? Why do they still remain? Why are they unanswered? What's keeping science from solving them all? So Rosenberg talks about the essential, debate in social science, and that is whether or not social science should follow the methods and principles of natural science. Yeah, he says when a social scientist attempts to follow natural scientific methods, then they're investing in that perspective of natural science. Yeah, they're investing in saying the questions that I'm asking are answerable by the perspectives of natural science, and those perspectives are empiricism and positivism. But there are some social scientists who have tried the natural scientific methods and they find them lacking. They say we cannot study human beings in the way that a physicist studies light or heat. We cannot study human beings the way that a biologist studies birds. Empirical methods are not appropriate for the study of human beings and for the study of our organization into culture. Because how can any one person's view of a culture be 100% accurate and objective? So we can't use our own faculties to measure another human being or their culture and that sort of thing, because we can never be accurate. We can never be objective. Yeah. So then we shouldn't use natural science. Anthropologists are at that forefront of saying we need to devise our own methods that are appropriate for the things that we're studying, because what we study in social science is very different from what they study in natural science. Rosenberg goes on to talk about the belief in the success of natural science, and the notion that basically natural science has been so successful in allowing us prediction that the basic philosophical question about where those limits lie for science is less important, right? We don't sit around and say, why can't I play a video game simply by closing my eyes and engaging with the computer in that way. We don't say, why are there limits to science? We instead say, look at this amazing machine that I have that allows me to play, Forza Motorsport or Medal of Honor or Gears of War, whatever, these incredibly complex, rich visuals and things like that. We're so amazed at the abilities of science that we forget about the limitations. So that's not true in the social science realm. In the social science realm, the philosophical questions are much more significant. There's a lack of consensus in social science as to the methods and questions that should be asked. So the philosophical questions raised are much more obvious and much more apparent. So when we look at something at the domains such as sociology and anthropology, these are studying very complex systems, right? They're studying culture and social behavior of humankind and that sort of thing. And they argue that empirical methods fail when we apply them to the study of mankind. So they're saying we need another form, another method beyond empiricism and beyond, the experiment. And if we look at an area of social science such as psychology, psychology is a great example of the split of the debates that we have. We don't have unified theories in many of these domains. In psychology, we have a split between behaviorism, between the folks who back Skinner and Watson, and the power that behaviorism has to predict and that sort of thing. And then there's other folks who say, no, we've got to include the mind. There's an issue of consciousness and subconscious. And that's called the Skinner-Freud split, because those are the two major theorists in the two between behaviorism and consciousness. Yeah. So Rosenberg talks about the traditional questions of social science, and one of the major questions there is whether or not we can explain our behavior the same way as we explain natural phenomena. So can we explain your choice for breakfast the same way that we explain the natural phenomena, let's say, of plants deriving nutrition and energy from the sun, and that's called photosynthesis. So can we say that your process of nutrition is explainable the same way that we explain the process of nutrition with plants and with gerbils and rats and that sort of thing. Another example, can we explain why two people choose to get married and how they get married in the same way that we explain how molecules bond together using ionic bonds, and how we get hydrogen and oxygen to come together and produce a molecule of water that we call H2O? Are those the same things, or are they different? And your choice, your decision of saying yes, it's the same thing. My choice for breakfast, lunch, and dinner is the same thing as photosynthesis, and the way that people get married is the same way that molecules join together. Or you're saying, no, they're not the same. Either one of those has a whole bunch of caveats and issues to consider, yeah? So if we say yes, that you can explain your nutrition the same way as we explain photosynthesis, then why do we do such a bad job? Why can't we predict what you're going to eat tomorrow morning for breakfast? Yeah, and why can't we guess based on certain bits of data what you're going to do for breakfast, lunch, and dinner? You may even have a plan. Tonight for dinner, I'm going to make myself a bowl of Simon with spam and fish cake or whatever, yeah? And then something else might happen. Oh, look, you open your refrigerator and you find in there a gorgeous piece of, smoked salmon or something like that. And you say, wow, boy, I think I'm going to have this instead, yeah? We can't explain those decisions and those sorts of things in the same way that we do with photosynthesis, yeah? Our explanations are much less precise and our predictions are much weaker when you compare them to natural science. So if you say no, that it's different, the way that two people come together and form a marriage is different from the way that two molecules come together, it's not the same as natural science? If so, then how should we understand human behavior? What approach should we apply to the understanding of human social interaction? And why should we choose that approach over any other? So one of the aspects there in choosing to explain human behavior is, should we explain it on the micro level or on the macro level? And what that means is, do we explain human actions in terms of the individuals or the micro level, or do we explain human action in terms of our social institutions and social groups, the macro level? Yeah. If we choose to go from individual behavior, we explain human action based on individuals, then that's called bottom-up explanation. Yeah, we're looking at individual choices. Oftentimes in social science, we're assuming that each individual is a rational individual. So, for example, there's a theory called rational choice theory that's used by economics and political science that says basically that human beings will act on a rational basis and make decisions based on a rational process. Yeah. Pardon me. If we choose instead to explain behavior in terms of the macro level, the largest group, then it's the large-scale social facts, right? That, in terms of, let's say, depression or global banking or economics or that sort of thing, that explain individual conduct. That explain why you buy the car that you buy, why you wear the clothes that you wear, why you have the job that you have, and so on and so forth. So rather than talk about individual choice, if you're explaining behavior from that top down, from the macro level, then you're probably talking about some sort of holism perspective where you're saying it all works together, yeah, and that it's typically something that our society is more than just that combination of individuals. It's something else that's sort of emergent from that process of individuals interacting, and that's sort of that notion of holism. There are other sorts of theories where we talk about conflict in society versus function in society. We'll talk more about that when we get into sociology. But that's sort of that notion of functionalism versus conflict. The theory is that our society works together because all the parts interact functionally and harmoniously, or all the parts interact due to a conflict and continuous competition. Yeah. So however we're choosing to explain human behavior, the theory that has the growing emphasis in these domains is evolutionary theory, and that's why we're going to take a look at it when we get into anthropology and that sort of thing. So another traditional question in social science is, what is the relationship between the study of human beings and what's known as moral philosophy, which is what can we deduce and what can we say that this study is telling us about how we should live and what we should do. Yeah. So, for example, sociology, economics talks about social interaction, talks about conflict, talks about functionalism, talks about social class and things like that. Talks about the processes of the market and how supply and demand work and all that kind of thing. But can they and should they lead us to some sort of solution for the homelessness problem? Yeah. Can sociology or economics point us to some sort of understanding of why people are homelessness and a way to correct that? And in terms of normative, is this the right thing to do? Yeah. Another aspect is, can political science direct us to the best form of government, and should it? Yeah. Is it the job of scientists studying politics to then take the next step and say, not only is this how things are, but then this is how things should be? Yeah. So let's look at this central question of, has natural science made greater progress than social science? And if so, can we speed up the progress of social science? Rosenberg says that that perspective includes specific presuppositions. Yeah, you are making certain assumptions when you make that statement. Those assumptions include that we know what progress in natural science is and how to measure it. Yeah, so we're saying that social science has not been as strong as natural science in terms of developing knowledge about the world that we can then use to improve our lives. Yeah. Well, Rosenberg is saying that when you make that statement, you're assuming that you know what progress in natural science is and how to measure it. Yeah. He's also saying that you're assuming that natural science has made greater progress than social science. And he's saying that not everyone agrees with that assumption. Matter of fact, some of the greatest thinkers in our current history have argued that natural science has not made greater progress than social science. And we'll take a look at that. That's Thomas Kuhn. Finally, that statement also presupposes that social science progress is exactly the same kind of progress that we see in natural science. Yeah, that we're seeking prediction as a signal or a signpost that progress has been made in social science. Yeah. So Rosenberg then goes on to review what is the established view of science, yeah, and the established view in that debate between natural science and social science, which is basically that natural science is better. Natural science, when compared to social science, rocks. So he says, we have this view that natural science is better because there's this general assumption that natural science has provided increasingly reliable knowledge about the physical world. Yeah. Whereas in comparison, social science appears to remain as successful at explanation and prediction of human behavior as the Greeks were. Yeah. So we've gotten to the point of being able to communicate with each other via a wireless device, yeah, this iPhone or cell phone or whatever. And that is a natural science. The idea is that we've got a better explanation of how the world works because we can use our explanation about the world to develop technology such as the iPhone. We can develop technology that sends us into space and allows us to land on the moon. You compare that to the success of prediction in social science. If we want to predict what will reduce illiteracy, or we want to predict what will reduce infant mortality, we do a very poor job of that. Conclusion, of course, is that when you look at it in this view, from this perspective, the conclusion would be that social science is flawed because social science isn't scientific enough to identify laws of human behavior. Yeah. So that established view would argue that social science needs to adopt better, more scientific methods to answer its questions. Rosenberg also, talks about how the established view is that natural science success has been in the discovery of regularities in the world that give us predictive power, and those understanding of those regularities allow us to predict with very high accuracy. Yeah, so we are, and that's absolutely correct. We can predict very, very well about events and occurrences in our natural world because we understand so much about those regularities that underlie them. Natural science seeks these causal explanations in terms of, for example, in answering a question as why do the tides go up and go down, or what causes fermented berries to become wine. We want to understand the cause because once we understand the cause, we can predict the reoccurrence. Once we understand the basic things that the aspects of the event, we can then say that when those aspects come together in the same way, they're going to produce the same event. So, laws in natural science provide us with causal explanations that give us reliable knowledge of the future, and it's so reliable that we can then use that knowledge to predict the reoccurrence of the tides. Yeah, and that knowledge is so regular. Those patterns in some of these patterns in science are so regular, such as the tides, that we can not only predict what the tides are going to be tomorrow, We can set up a calendar for the next year that tell us what the tides are going to be in Honolulu Harbor. And based on our knowledge of the world and gravity and the moon and that sort of thing, we can also generalize our information about the tides in Honolulu Harbor to tides in Lahaina Harbor, to tides in San Francisco Harbor, to tides in any harbor anywhere around the world. Yeah. So because we understand those patterns and we have a causal explanation that tells us why these patterns occur, we can then use that understanding to predict what's going to happen in the future. That is our established view of science. And so causation requires laws, and laws, we understand natural laws because of our observation of regularities in the world. Regularities are those patterns of events in sequence. So we search for regularities in our environment, those patterns of events that occur together, and we also look for those exceptions that occur to those regularities. So for example, we want to understand why it seems that the water gets higher at certain times of the day and gets lower at other times in the ocean, right? And basically, we're making our own observations. We can go down to the shore and we can watch the water, and we can notice that, geez, at a certain, it seems like it gets higher for a certain period of time, then it seems to go lower, and then it seems to go higher, and then it seems to go lower, and it happens roughly, higher twice a day and lower twice a day. If we pay enough attention to this and we're able to see these patterns, and basically then we come up with an idea that these patterns, work in a certain way. We may not understand that it happens because of gravity and because of the moon's pull on the earth and that sort of thing. But we can use that understanding of these patterns occurring and so on and so forth. We get a sense that there is some sort of relation of these patterns, and that once we identify patterns with no exceptions, we call those natural laws. Yeah. Even though we've identified many natural laws, the search continues for ever more fundamental laws, especially in physics. Yeah. And we'll talk about why that is. So the established view of science, according to Rosenberg, is that notion of, we've got this ability to identify causality because of our ability to identify regulation and regular patterns in the world. Yeah. David Hume talked about causality. David Hume was one of the folks who said, we need to be careful with our notions of what's a cause and what isn't. He says, we have this idea that we're identifying empirical laws based on causation. Yeah, causation is the operation of empirical laws. So laws basically, we assume, connect the event that we're investigating with observations of prior events, specifically with patterns of prior events. So for example, laws connect the observation of the apple falling from the tree with Newton observing it to patterns of prior events, to every single apple he's ever seen fall from a tree. Yeah. And so there's that connection underneath of all the things being drawn to the earth, that there is some sort of causality. How do we explain that cause? Because there is a force that we label gravity that exists, that pulls all objects to the earth. Yeah. Then when we take that idea of this is the causal rule, that gravity exists and that it functions this way, we can generalize from that one pattern of prior events to an event that is yet to happen. And that is what prediction is. And that's what folks think is so great about science, is that we can say, because we have a natural law that all things fall to earth, when that apple gets ripe enough, it will fall from the tree. We can predict. Yeah. We can predict that eventually all the apples will fall from that tree. And boy, don't we look smart when our prediction comes true. So, but Hume, being the skeptic that he was, took a critical eye towards causality. And he said, we have this idea that when we talk about events in the world, one thing causes another, that, the child disobeyed their parent, causing the parent to strike the child, or a rock is thrown and strikes a window and causes the window to break. But he says there's no logical justification for this idea of causality. He says nothing in our perceptions really tells us that anything causes anything else. All that our perceptions can tell us is that some events regularly occur immediately after certain other events. And we use the concept of causation to make sense of why that happens. So we know that when you propel a rock at a certain speed towards a pane of glass, we know that regularly it strikes the glass and the glass then shatters. And we have this concept in our head that the rock striking the glass caused it to shatter. Hume says that we can come up with other logical justifications for why the glass broke at that time, beside the rock striking it. Yeah, perhaps there's a temperature change that we are unaware of. Perhaps there are minute flaws within the glass, and the temperature change was just enough to cause these flaws in the glass to reach critical mass and shatter the glass just as the rock was almost about to hit it. Yeah? And maybe that glass actually shattered before the rock actually touched it. Yeah? We don't have the faculties. We don't have the senses to perceive that. Yeah? So he says that we use this concept of causation, but it's not really logically justifiable. And if it's not logically justifiable, then all of this power of science that we talk about in terms of using natural laws to understand the causation of patterns in our environment, he says this is just another concept that human beings employ. It's not logically justifiable. We may be completely wrong about causality. Well, I hope you enjoyed this lecture. That's the end of part one. Stay tuned for part two, when we're going to get into those aspects of natural science and social science. And if you have any questions about your reading or about this lecture, feel free to give me a call or send me an email. Hui ho.